Hello and welcome. I am Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill.
And I'm Rafael Bernal, staff writer at The Hill. This is the first in a series of digital interviews The Hill will be conducting to understand the foundations of systemic racism and implicit bias in our country.
Acknowledging the effects of racism on communities of color is the first step toward change. Over the next several weeks, we will speak with leaders from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to understand the conditions that perpetuate inequality and why this moment could serve as a catalyst to build a better nation.
Our guest today is the Majority Whip in the House of Representatives. Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina is the third-ranking Democrat in the House.
And also the highest-ranking black congressional leader in the House. He is a past chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus and a man who many of his colleagues turn to for counsel. Welcome, Congressman Clyburn.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me just start and ask you, just point blank. We're living in a stressed out time. Race is important. In your estimation, has this White House done anything constructive in the moment that matters for people of color and ending systemic racism in this nation?
Absolutely not. In fact, if we were to judge what's been going on in the White House, it has been to preserve or at least take us back to the foundations upon which this institutional racism were built. I think all of us ought to acknowledge two things. Number one, that most white people came to this country of their own free will in search of liberty. Most black people came to this country against their will and were enslaved. And the early underpinnings of our society were all set on preserving that existence. We went to war as a nation with each other over the institution of slavery. And we know that. And so what we have to do is come to grips with the fact that those two pillars upon which we've built this society are still lingering. We hear talk all the time about the vestiges of slavery. Yes, they do exist, but there are also the lingering effects of Jim Crow. Black folks stayed enslaved 244 years. Do the math. See how many generations that will give you. And for all of a sudden now, we see people pretending not to understand what that's all about. That's how you get institutional racism.
Expanding on Steve's point, if the White House hasn't been able to deal with this moment, has Congress as an institution been able to step up where the White House hasn't?
Well, I think we ought to be fair with those kinds of issues. Congress is made up of two bodies, the House and the Senate. The third body in all of this would be the executive. So no matter what you do in the House, it's got to be agreed to in the Senate, and then it's got to be agreed to by the executive. And if the executive disagrees, it takes 2/3 of both houses to overcome that. So that's what we're up against. And it's not as simple as saying Congress needs to fill in the gap when the president is not doing. That, we all know, is a pretty high hill to climb.
Congressman, I think one of the questions that a lot of people out there are asking right now is, what does social and racial justice look like? How do you build it? We've seen protests in the past, Rodney King. Now we, of course, have the protests sparked by George Floyd's murder, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, others out there. And some are saying we've seen this before, a lot of protests and nothing happens. But some are hopeful. What do you think, when you're communicating, what are the building blocks of social justice so that this becomes a real moment rather than one that we get a flare up and then disappears? What does that look like?
Well, it looks like the pursuit of a more perfect union. It looks like living out the pledge of allegiance that ends with that vision of liberty and justice for all. It looks like the biblical-based golden rule It looks like if you're Old Testament, Michael 6:8, to do justice, love mercy, and be humble. Or if you are a Christian who believes in the New Testament, then it is simply doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Those are just fundamental things. Now, we can dress it up in the way we want to. We can add legislative procedures and accomplishments to it, but it all boils down to those basic Judeo-Christian principles upon which this society dreams, but has never been able to fulfill.
So on the point of those dreams, it seems like at this moment, there is a more general understanding of why it is that our society has been unfair to some people and more fair to some others. What do you think changed? Those Judeo-Christian principles have been there for a long time, at least 2,000 years. What is it that people generally, and white people specifically, are understanding about the oppression of others in this country?
Well, whenever there's deniability, we tend to take advantage of it. And it's always been there. I think that what is happening all of a sudden, I think what is our great blessing is also our curse. That is the internet. All of a sudden now, things that people used to write about or talk about, or in some instances, just kind of whisper, they now see it in the wide open. I don't know to tell you how many times I've heard people talk about what happened. Well, tell me what happened in the minutes before. Took the shooting of Walter Scott. Walter Scott was shot in the back, running away from the police officer. But nobody saw what happened immediately before. And so the question was, yes, that's what we see. But what led to that? Well, when it came to George Floyd, we saw it all. And we saw what led to it. We saw it taking place. We saw a lynching just before our eyes. And that made all the difference. People decided that, wait a minute, this is not an issue to just talk about. We see it, and that old adage, one picture is worth 1,000 words. So we did not need to apply those words. We saw the one picture.
That photo, that video that you said made this so real for people. And I find sometimes the discussion about race has a kind of, other world quality. It's not, here for us. People don't feel it. I think people are trying to. And we didn't pre-orchestrate this, but I'm wondering if you would share with us. You're a leader. You've been talking about this. Tell us about your own experiences with systemic racism as you've encountered them in your life, your career, among your colleagues, and share with our public your own encounters.
Well, my encounters have been more impersonal. I've been doing a lot of thinking about that because people are asking me all these questions about, well, how have you experienced racism? I've lived it. I have not had any kind of physical stuff. John Lewis and I have talked about this a lot. Did not have John Lewis experiences. Though John and I both met back in 1960, we were both integral parts of the establishment of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that we call SNCC. He was a different warrior than I have been. When we used to have marches and demonstrations at South Carolina State and Claflin University, I was always called upon to pray before the march. I was the preacher's kid, and so they sort of made the preacher out of me. I didn't get hit across the head. I was never spat upon. I was in all the marches, but for some reason, I never experienced that. My experiences came in these institutions. The morning after I was elected, to Congress in 1992, I got on an elevator here in Columbia, and when the elevator stopped on the floor, two young white ladies refused to step on the elevator because I was there. These kinds of things I've experienced. I've experienced going to jail for trying to sit at a lunch counter. So I've had these experiences, but the raw callousness, the viciousness that John Lewis experienced, I never have experienced.
Now, I want to stay on your experience, but switch a little to the political side of your experience. Just this year, your endorsement was critical in getting former Vice President Joe Biden to win the Democratic nomination. And at the moment, it seems like ages ago when we were talking about who's going to be the nominee, before all these issues that are now central, at that time, there was talk of a black and brown divide because black voters were the backbone to Vice President Biden's campaign, and Hispanic voters were the backbone to Senator Sanders' campaign. That seems to have gone away between coronavirus, between this talk of racial justice. Why did that talk go away? What happened to that alleged black and brown divide?
Well, because I don't think it really existed to any significant degree. I think that we all are interested in making the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for all. I think that what people all of a sudden began to realize with the advent of COVID-19, that when it comes to healthcare, black and brown Americans are experiencing the absence of healthcare, experiencing the absence of online learning that is necessary in this day and time. These things that we have been talking about, all of a sudden now, we're beginning to live them. And then we see leadership in the White House refusing to acknowledge the existence of these things. And so I think that what black and brown people have begun to understand, that we're all in this together. And we cannot win this fight fighting each other. We got to come together as one, and we got to attack this institution called racism. And if we continue to have a divide, we will continue to suffer the consequences. Divide and conquer is as old as the hills. And I think black and brown people are beginning to understand that. I made it very clear that everybody keeps telling me, well, Joe Biden didn't do this. Joe Biden did do that. I saw on the internet somebody accusing me of ramming Joe Biden down their throats. No, I've asked people to compare Joe Biden to the alternative, not the almighty. No, he is not perfect. None of us is. But what we've got to do is to continue the pursuit of a perfect nation.
Congressman, we have right now protests in the streets. Some of those protests are bringing down statues of Confederate generals and leaders, but they have also managed to tear down statues of some abolitionists, of women's rights movements, of President Ulysses S. Grant. And I'm just interested in where you think those lines should be and how you feel about this moment where people are tearing down statues and names that have been part of American history up until this point.
Well, to that I say ignorance is bliss. The fact of the matter is, that's why I'm a big advocate of people sitting down around the table and having sensible discussions. And if there were to have sensible discussions about these things, people would be more careful about anything that resembles mob action. And that's what happens to say Ulysses Grant. I know enough about history to know that Ulysses Grant was the best friend that former slaves had coming out of the Civil War. I know that what caused him great pause when he was about to get married, the young lady he wanted to marry, he had real problems with the fact that her family owned slaves. I know he was made a gift of a slave that he set free. And I think that if people knew Ulysses Grant history, they would not tear down his statue. And that's why we have to be careful. You should go through this. All the people who lived during this period of time did not advocate slavery. He never did. He was just the opposite. And so it was a big mistake on the part of anybody to tear down his statue. And the same thing applies to a lot of others. Now, everybody says, well, George Washington owned slaves. Yes, he did. He set them free. He didn't fight to keep people enslaved. He fought to create a country, and he resisted any notion of making himself a monarch, refusing to run for the office for fear that it might look that way. He was, in fact, the father of the country, so to speak. And I think that he demonstrated that he was not a man of his times when he set those slaves free. So we ought to look at all of this and ought to look at why are we here in South Carolina. I think the two statues we got up there, John C. Calhoun, one of the biggest proponents of slavery. And I'm glad to see that Charleston, South Carolina, took a statue down at Clemson, took his name off their honors college. I think that we ought to go through all of these things. Wade Hampton's got no business representing South Carolina up there in Satterfield Hall or in the Capitol. I think we've done a good thing. We're going to do it next week when we pass those appropriation bills to take these statues out. We're not going to tear them down. We're going to remove them, put them over in the Smithsonian, and let the states decide what they want to do with them. But we as a Congress ought not have them in places of honor in our capital. But we ought to go through all of these things, study these issues, look at who these people were, have a sensible discussion, and then make a decision as to whether or not they deserve a place of honor.
Well, Congressman Clyburn, this is a very quick dive into a deep dive issue. We're grateful for your insights and reflections. Thanks so much for joining us. On behalf of my colleague, Rafael.
Thank you for talking with us, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all very much for joining us. We'll be back soon with more in this series on systemic racism in America.